Previously, on Sounds from the Year Between.
And then her talking could be teaching.
Since there were 30 of us, we did this by throwing ideas into a spreadsheet and then voting.
And that their dry rib is superior.
Don't tell me that. It'll hurt.
I just love badass women.
And coming up on this episode...
And in the end, they all had some banana bread. And that's how the first Year Between baby was conceived.
That's appalling but oddly fascinating.
But now...
Gnomes, elves, and
The
horns.
spectacular rainbow.
4,223.
Achten Tan.
Episode Extra. A very Terry episode.
So look, Terry, this is an episode all about you. All that you've written and inspired in Achten Tan and Skullgate Media, and why it is you are called Terry.
Yeah, I don't think I'm comfortable taking up an entire episode. Let's call it like a bonus episode or something, and we'll say it's number 3.5, and then it doesn't seem as self-celebratory.
You're allowed to have people say nice things about you, Terry. How about bonus? A very Terry episode. You could be a Doctor Who holiday special. Time travel that back up to the beginning, buddy. You did write quite a lot of stuff for Achten Tan, though. And you have become a major part of Skullgate Media. You're not denying any of that, right? I mean, you are one of the editors for our Loathsome Voyagers weird fiction anthology, soon to be released.
That is true. CD Stories and I have the very great honour of working on that, and it's going to be awesome. More about that soon, I would expect. I'm not exactly sure, at some point.
And I'm pretty sure I remember you being one of the major instigators when we were throwing around ideas in chat, too.
Oh, yeah, no, so I remember our Lord and Saviour Chris Prime saying near the start that he wanted this thing to be like as wildly creative as it could be. So I basically thought I would just try to do as much as I could that nobody else would have done. So I was sort of striving to be the whole Year Between approach in microcosm, I guess.
So what was the first thing you wrote for Achten Tan?
Well, you know, the rules, such as they are, of the Year Between creative process basically say that you shouldn't come up with any ideas before we've played the game that we use to generate the world, but I broke that rule with Old Crawman, I'm pretty sure. It was really early on in the Twitter message thread when we were all just kind of getting to know each other and messing around, and being me, I was trying to, like, impress people with bad puns and stuff, so somebody threw out the idea that if the town was in a giant skeleton, then there must be areas like North Ribs. And so I just went, okay, so there must be a ribs joint, right? It's North Ribs is the best ribs in North Ribs. And of course, I still had to officially air quotes, create that later on during the actual game. But I think even before the game started, I decided that I was going to do a piece on Old Crawman, who's the sort of grumpy proprietor of the restaurant. And he's trying to find someone to take over so that he can retire and or die, basically.
I love how in the book, it's a series of clippings from, I guess the town has a newspaper now, with headlines ranging from "Competitors Wanted" to "Shocking Result in North Ribs Succession Plan." Not sure how well it will translate to audio, but let's have a listen.
Yeah, and thank you for finding some people to read this, actually. I haven't heard this yet, so I'm eager and keen and excited.
Competitors wanted. Are you the next master of North Ribs? Come to North Ribs, just south of the north side of North Ribs. If you get to North Ribs, you've gone too far. The next time the sun shines across the tar wastes in such a way that the ground does that little sort of glistening, bubbly thing it sometimes does, on that day shall a great contest commence. Entrants must have culinary nous, be willing to learn, and not smell of ants. The contest begins. The search for the new Crawman. The bracket is set for the latest and greatest cooking competition ever to grace the bones of Achten Tan, Achten Tan Stir Chef. We realize now is less catchy written down, but if you say it out loud and think about the words master and chef, we reckon it works well enough. It's the contest to end all contests, at least until the next one. Old Crawman, owner and chief proprietor of North Ribs, seeks his successor so he can... And here we quote his own words from the masterful and rousing speech he gave at the opening ceremony. Just retire and/or die already. With 8 entrants from all over Achten Tan, things are bound to get hotter than White Jan's hot and handsome ribs with bee chili sauce. Available from South Ribs, but it was the hottest thing we could think of. The first round starts next week, and it's a doozy. Old Crawman challenges each of his potential replacements to pick just 2 ingredients from the famous North Ribs pantry and create an inspired recipe focused on these ingredients. Stay tuned for updates. Isn't it nice to have something fun and community-minded to focus on? Every other page of this publication is about some sort of ridiculous disaster. Dolphin Joe ill, Bogle is on the move. What a year this is turning out to be, eh? Turn to page 46 for Jaren's prognostications and find out why Opuhaku's unfortunate passing means you should rearrange the lemons in your fruit bowl. Semifinals to win Old Crawman's love. Broom holder hold brooms, janitor of the house of worship, birth and rebirth, should really have known better than to try serving up ant ribs. Ant exoskeletons don't even have ribs. Who will be victorious? The semifinal round had a 75% survival rate. Achelia and Garpek's final test is to manage North Ribs for 1 day, including every element of coordinating the staff, taking orders, running the numbers, performing the elven great rituals required to injure, ward, and seal the dimensionless one who dislikes ribs in the basement, and of course the thrice daily check on the state of the toilets. Shocking results in North Ribs succession plan. Well, that was weird. We really don't need to recount it, do we? You were all either there or saw it in the mirror shards. Record numbers of people crowded around mirror shards to watch the broadcast, as those of you who queued for hours will be keenly aware. But hey, for posterity, the man formerly known as One Thumb Garpek, but presumably he'll have to find a new nickname now, started out strong, but a complaint from a customer who asked for full fat ant milk and got semi-skinned was simply too much for him to handle, and the resulting chaos may well have left permanent scars on the bodies and minds of all those in attendance. Achelia, on the other hand, simply made a couple of plates of delicious ribs herself before wandering off to look at a stream or something. Also, the ribs were vegetarian, which nobody really wanted. Old Crawman took it better than most were expecting, commencing a gracious address about how difficult it must be to come into a demanding position, before rapidly descending into deep, rumbling guffaws, proclaiming that he knew it, he bloody knew it, he's irreplaceable. And none will ever overthrow him as the undisputed king of all ribs restaurants in Achten Tan. So, all of that seems to have been for nothing, but heck, it was entertaining. Oh, and we had already planned this article for the front page before the whole Ardeun religious takeover and the return of Saphira and Rapeaka Parlor and all those big deals. Hastily written bulletins on those matters can be found on pages 8 and 15 if you're the sort of person who reads this thing for actual important news rather than comparatively trivial vignettes about local restaurants.
Oh man, old Crawman. I want to say like what a character, but I feel bad because I made him up. But then the whole point of this is that none of us really own any of it. We've all shared this world. So yeah, what a character old Crawman is, because a lot of people, went into making him what he is, and I'm proud to have been a little part of that. He's awesome.
He sure is. I remember another throwaway joke that you made in the Twitter thread about him that ended up becoming a piece in its own right. Let's hear that one.
Son, you've been raised on ribs. You've been raised in ribs. You eat ribs. Your house is a giant rib. Your family business is in ribs. Ribs paid for you to live in a rib. Where would you be without ribs?
Auto-filleting?
Get out.
Okay, so that I'm pretty sure is the shortest piece in the entire book. There's probably a joke there about a short piece, but I don't think I'm going to make that joke.
Hate to tell you, but I think you just did. Giggity.
Oh, yeah.
So what else did you write early on?
Well, I really wanted to do something in a format that would be cool and that would be unique, and I figured writing a piece of music would be an interesting way to do that. So I think the first piece that I actually wrote after the game was finished was a hymn.
A hymn? I have to admit, the first thing I did for this was a song as well. An old folk tune about a gnome down on the algae farm.
Well, yeah, I did a hymn and like an accompanying essay about the musicology of the hymn, just because I figured I may as well.
How very scholarly of you. Let's hear the essay.
The Hymn of Birth and Rebirth, an essay, written by Nathalane the Literate. This short hymn is one of our most popular and enduring. Believed to have been composed some several hundred years ago, it is still performed to this day. The original author or authors may have devised the music and the text together or separately, or perhaps multiple branches of work by multiple creators took place simultaneously. The composition borrows from far southern pagan worship singers in its harmonic progressions, making use of chord colors not frequently seen in early music outside that region. The entire arrangement is emblematic of birth and rebirth, presenting a motif which is briefly set aside before returning, the same, yet anew. I've seen some suggestion that the melody may itself be borrowed from an earlier hymn to the Landwalkers, but have not been able to corroborate this independently. The hymn, originally notated with ambiguous instrumentation, has been arranged here for 4 voice types and accompanied by a calcare, a kind of progressive melodic instrument played by striking several rows of tuned bone keys with small felted mallets. I believe this permutation likely to be close to the original setting, if not exactly correct. The calcare predates the hymn's purported composition by some decades and appears a good tonal match, if nothing else. An approximation of the music has been performed and sealed into vibrating devices of sorts which reproduces the tones of the calcare and uses strings to mimic the vocal parts. You will notice that I have given several variations of the lyrics. Those given in the first set below, and in the notated music, are the original Middle Achten, on the phonetic and linguistic characteristics of which more below, in a particular religious dialect used mostly for oral storytelling and music. The second set is, as nearly as is possible, a direct or literal translation of the text with no regard to rhyme or meter. The third set is an early modern setting of the hymn in which what would now be considered archaic, albeit comprehensible, modern language, and the fourth is a contemporary setting, by a teacher of mine in fact. Most performances of the hymn continue to use the original Middle Achten, despite it being officially a dead language with no remaining speakers, either native or as a second language, since not enough examples outside religious texts such as this remain to extract conversational phrases. One idiosyncratic difficulty of translating Middle Achten is that it has no strict temporal delineation, nor does it have affixes such as re, which would point to one thing coming before or after another in sequence. As such, the word birth, ruti, is the same as that for rebirth, which is perhaps to be expected given that the doctrine of the time held that there was no difference between life and death and subsequent new life, that they were simply variations on the same state. See Calrose in Grey Crown's Dogmas of Bygone Eras for commentary on the theological teachings, and the 14th letter in the collection of letters to the prodigy Maragard from his humble teacher once illuminated Jar, sadly posthumously published in an incomplete form, but I understand Tilia of the Great Library may be working on a new edition. For some compelling, if dubiously obtuse, musings on Middle Achten speakers' perception of time as a unified one-directional sequence, as opposed to a multitude of micro-sequences in which infinite before-after progressions form no singular timeline. At any rate, those phrases in Ie la Ruti, which imply a direction of time, bone to beast to bone in that order, for example, would be interpreted as much more cyclical and simultaneous by a Middle Achten speaker than the linear travel a modern listener would likely hear. Phonologically, Middle Achten is considered one of the more transcendent languages of its age, which is to say it is still regarded as capable of accessing divine beauty to a greater extent than other languages more suited to everyday transactions. This is, of course, a matter of subjective preference on the part of the listener, but I find it hard to disagree with those who observe that it is uniquely well fitted to music intended to inspire some sense of awe in those who hear it. Some of the sounds that a modern reader may find less familiar and harder to reproduce are given below in the hopes that it will aid performance and appreciation of the piece. I hope that this essay will bring a new appreciation of Yiela Varuti to a modern audience.
So there's a bit going on there. Most of it is just completely made up statements. You know, the stuff that refers to other musical traditions in the world is obviously nonsense. But there's just enough actual music theory behind that to make it sound vaguely believable, I hope.
Could have fooled me, but to be fair, I am easily fooled.
It does mention in the essay, by the way, that there's a performance available in the Great Library, so shall we have a listen to that?
Let's do it!
And there we go. So, of course, the strings there are doing the lines that would be sung by people if it were an actual hymn, but I don't have the time or the ability to actually sing a 5-part hymn.
That seems fair, and gives a chance for fan versions, especially since you can find the complete essay as well as the sheet music for the hymn in the published book. And the ebook version even has a link to listen to the audio. Very possible to make your own. And if you do make a fan version, please send them in. Please. It truly impresses me, Terry, how you really like to delve and create details that, frankly, no one ever asked for.
Yeah, well, you know, I love the whole thing about fictions within fictions, you know, and I know Chris Prime does too, and so one of the things he and I did was collaborate on a few fake titles to put in an order form in the back of Achten Tan, which was pretty fun.
Oh, like this book but better, a special edition of Achten Tan, but without any of the parts you didn't like? Or that novel you meant to write?
Those exactly, D. And you know what, there's an absolute ton of even sillier stuff that didn't make it in, which is there are many things, many things.
You made up a whole lot of titles for the Great Library as well, didn't you? Please, tell me you wrote something else about that.
Yeah, of course I did. I really liked the idea of a librarian reading through some of the books that maybe like nobody had got to in a while and just kind of making vaguely amusing notes about these volumes. So during the game I made sure to add Taila the librarian into the world.
So you made up a bunch of books within the world and then had someone writing notes about them. You realize I work in a library, yes? This is pretty hot stuff for a sapiosensual.
Yep, did it with a hymn, did it with a load of books.
Fair enough. Rawr. Let's hear from this librarian.
Notes from one librarian to another. Written by Antalya, head archivist of the Great Library. To whom it may concern, hello, future librarian. Welcome to the Great Library of Achten Tan. You'll come to discover it may not seem particularly great in the scheme of things, but, well, it's the only one for quite some distance in any direction. It's also home, as are all good libraries, to several texts that are much more interesting and important than you might expect. Don't forget that books aren't only the records of history. Knowledge from books is what those who lived through history use to change it, to set the path. I may have not lived through much history, youngest appointee ever to the position of head librarian, and if you're younger than I was when I took the position, I just want you to know that intellectually I don't hate you, but there is a good chance you'll occasionally catch me staring at you with what appears to be unbridled rage, and you're just going to have to deal with that. But I have lived through some truly odd times. I was the librarian in that year. Perhaps you'll remember it, certainly you won't have forgotten it if you were here to see it. Enclosed are a few of my notes on some of the more unusual works in the Great Library. Perhaps you'll have the time to finish some of the work I started. I'm not disorganized, but there tend to be an awful lot of interruptions around here for some reason. Look, I'm writing this now because it seems like a worthwhile thing to do, but you're probably reading this years in the future, and to be honest, I expect I've explained all this in person anyway. Maybe I'll just sign this page and then burn it. Hey, if I'm burning it, I can write whatever I like. Fuck! Ha! I've always wanted to write that in a serious document. With regards and probable irrational disdain, Tyler, head archivist and chief librarian.
So at this point, I kind of figured I was done writing pieces for the book, but then more dumb ideas kept happening. Like, it's all completely because of how collaborative and how creative this entire process was. So in the weirdest discussions with people in the group, I would just suddenly get a like, I have to do a piece about that right now kind of vibe, which was awesome.
Like when we started doing Achten Write, the nonsense writing prompt on Twitter, and one of the prompts was something about there being 3 different styles of writing in Achten Tan?
Exactly, yeah, so naturally I had to write an essay on what those 3 styles might be.
Naturally.
And that piece is called On the Written Modalities of Achten Tanian, and it is in the back of Achten Tan. So here's a little excerpt. It is not all that peculiar that a single society with a single spoken language should have multiple forms of writing. Think, for example, of the Caridanius people who lived many thousands of years ago. They had but a single way of writing each concept, but they borrowed from several different systems of proto-writing before them, so that they conveyed most information pictorially, but also used a simple system of increasing lines to denote numbers. It is no wonder that they suffered an extremely severe economic crash that ultimately all but wiped them out entirely. Have you ever tried to count adjacent lines numbering in the thousands, even without accounting for the fact that those lines represented figures that would be extremely important to get precisely right lest the entire monetary system collapse? I thought not. Still, Achten Tan is unusual in that it has no fewer than 3 completely distinct written modalities. The first we call phonemic Tanian because it employs an alphabet, each letter of which represents a specific sound. By combining sequences of letters, we can create a graphical representation of a word as we would speak it aloud. There is also a semanto-phonetic variant of phonemic Tanian, that is to say, a sort of spin-off written dialect which uses compounds of characters, generally one to do with meaning and one to do with sound, to represent concepts as opposed to directly mapping to the spoken language. Most consider this not a modality in its own right and instead refer to it as phonemic Tanian B. It is believed to have been invented by a distant ancestor of Old Crawmans, a generations ago proprietor of North Ribs who was apparently dissatisfied at phonemic Tanian A's inability to represent menu items in a way that would not only tell the customer what it was, but also communicate precisely how delicious it would be. Logogrammic Actianian represents not individual phonemes but entire lexical units, that is to say that every written character is an entire word. Custom dictates it be written on dried ant hide using a quill formed of bone cut from one of the great vertebrae and filled with ink concentrated from godfruit paste. For this reason, it is quite rare these days to see an example of this written form that a pedant would consider a true use. Historically, it seems that it was most commonly used to send ominous notes of demand or ultimatum to military opponents, since the medium lent itself to being somewhat creepy and the simple logograms were easy to decipher as threatening even if the recipient was not familiar with the language. Finally, Meaningful Dave. As an aside, nobody is entirely sure why the second word in each modality's name should be different. Why not have all 3 be Tanian or Achtianian? And what is a Dave anyway? Nobody knows, but this is a convention now. And what is a convention if not something to be carried on in ignorance even when patently better solutions are readily apparent? Meaningful Dave is neither phonetic nor pictorial. It depicts neither sounds, nor words, nor image of the referent. It is instead a method, as the name suggests, of directly representing the true meaning of a statement. It is impossible to attempt to explain this. It is of peculiar note that there is a single arrangement of lines which can be written down to create an apprehensible communication of longer than 3 words in all 3 modalities. It is as follows. The tower of bone may one day fall, but that day will be too late. Of course, the meaning of that phonemic Tanian sentence is clear to anyone who has been able to follow this text so far. When written in cursive, however, the series of pen marks that you see form logograms and semantophores as well as the phonetic alphabet. To a logogrammic Actianian reader, it would mean something like, "She who ended the chief will begin the witch anew." I am assured that, despite sounding rather prophecy-like, the fact that these sentences can be understood does not necessarily mean that something ominous is going to come to pass. One familiar with Meaningful Dave might see, when this sentence is written in a kind of bubble writing, "Don't do it, y'all. Don't eat that fruit. It just ain't gonna go well, my dudes." It is odd to come across a sentence with such definite dialectical inflections in Meaningful Dave, since it has no faculty for representing the manner in which to speak the concepts aloud, but there you have it. Just for the sake of completeness, it bears recording that it is also meaningful in phonemic Tanian B. It reads mild Anchor-mate and his macroscopic telescopic lenticular monocular, which happens to be the title of a children's song that was very popular in my youth.
Wait, my old Anchor-mate and his macroscopic telescopic lenticular... Macroscopic telescopic lenticular monocular. Macroscopic telescopic lenticular monocular? Macroscopic telescopic lenticular monocular. I said it. Please, tell me you actually wrote that song too.
Of course I did. It's the only thing I wrote that didn't actually ever get published in any capacity, though, in either the book or the Apocrypha section of yearbetween.com, so maybe we could do the first ever performance right now.
A first ever performance? Right here? Right now? Let's do it!
Yeah, oh wait, hang on, I actually haven't. I've got the words, I haven't got music. Next time, maybe.
Oh. Well, you gotta leave him wanting more. And we must be drawing near the end of your contributions, surely. This is turning into the longest minisode in history.
Well, you know me, Dee. I hear one sentence of an offhand joke and an hour later I've written an entire play about it.
A play? Eh?
I think I have our friend Debbie Yanku Haddad to thank for this, because I'm sure it was her that made some sort of suggestion about how eating angels might lead to bad fortune, and then an hour later I had a whole morality play, somehow.
And you recorded a performance and everything. So let's hear that.
Hello? This is, well, I mean, you're listening to it, so you understand some of this, but this is an audio recording, if you can conceive of how such a thing would work. It's been etched using a series of lines of varying depths into the surface of a magic mirror, which we didn't know was possible, but apparently it is, so there you go. My name's Lumberjack, and I am the assistant to Taila of the Great Library. Assistant, you know, she wouldn't call me that, but anyway, it's fine. Look, so what we've done is we've arranged a sort of, well, it's like a play, but it's a presentation where you don't actually have to go and see the play, because we thought it would be nice, you know, you can kind of have that joy inside your home, if you can even imagine how would that work. But it does work. The proof is in the pudding, and you're eating the pudding right now by listening to this somehow. So I guess this is good, actually, because this means that in the future we've invented a device for actually playing back what we're doing right now, which means that all of this wasn't for nothing. Okay, good. So what we've done is we've recorded a play. And that play is Om Noms, The Holy Ones, which, of course, we all know very well. We all enjoy it very much. It's a play that was written, we think, sometime in that year, basically as a way of sort of providing a quasi-historical justification for the fact that every single fucking thing happened in that year. According to the author of this play, it's because our ancestors just couldn't stop eating angels. Whether that's historically true or not is up for some debate, at least. Of course, there are references, pastiches to people we all know and love, sights, sounds, brothels, or fuck houses, as most of you probably know them. And so, yes, so very well. Okay, I think I've rambled long enough. Please enjoy our audio presentation of Om Noms, The Holy Ones, by the Great Library, copyright protected or whatever. Hello. This is the historical play Om Noms, The Holy Ones, narrated by me, Northmi Palar, grandson of the famous explorer, of course, Rapacio Palar. Introduction. Om Noms, The Holy Ones. Being a historical comedy in but one short act, that such a performance may be mightily enjoyed by the many peoples in the briefest and most efficacious manner. The setting is thus: an imagined reconstruction of a past time in the history of Achten Tan, that a moral fable might be spun. Any resemblance that might be borne to those non-fictional citizens of Achten Tan, be they living or be they passed on, be not purely coincidental, but for legal purposes is herewith stated, at least mostly coincidental. Dramatis personae. Crumped, a gnome.
Crumped shall be played by Pigamus, the gnome.
Croman the youth, a restaurateur. Hi, I'm North. I work at North Ribs, and I'll be playing Croman the youth. Bartimazel, a mysterious visitor from the heavens.
Bartimazel the angel shall be portrayed by Bone Chief Opu Haku, his cousin Jeff Haku.
And Jezebone, a filthy whore.
Jezebone is played by Lara Mind, who is also, coincidentally, a filthy whore.
Act 1. Enter Crumpt and Jezebone.
Dear Jezebone, sweet Jezebone, my love, when may poor Crumpt once more caress thine breasts?
You frugalest of gnomes. You give me no hot meal and expect that I should be willing to grant a dirty fondle? You've no manner with women.
Yet there lieth before me no such food that I might grant, e'en willing as I am. This city Achten Tan is e'er starving, and poor Crumpt has for his due not a single slice of dirty ham.
Crumpt attempteth to deploy a firm squeeze upon the bosom of Jezebone, who shalt dismay the gnome's lecherous digits with a hearty slap.
Then how mayst thou explain yon endeavour so successful, whereupon the sale of meat most juicy, and juicier e'en than I, mark thee, that Crawman the youth hath established?
Enter Crawman the youth. All right.
Good sir, with pockets lined of gold, mark me, for this callous gnome shall expect for free all the range of wares I have to hawk, from a gentle kiss to rear-end stuff, and in exchange not even a plate to fill my belly.
Oh, that's no good, is it?
This lady, if a lady she doth be, hath cast doubt upon mine generosity. You must tell me, O vendor of fine mealings, the secret of thine success, that I might find myself in throes of lavish woman feelings.
You want me to let you in on how I'm making my business a success so that you can bone a prostitute?
Thine laconic and cutting speech doth express, this is a man with cloaked and veiled success, the secret which he shall not willingly part.
Did you mean to say that out loud? Because you were sort of staring off, but I can still hear you.
Foiled!
I do think I shall leave you, gnome, and seek the embrace of a real man with real gold.
Look, I don't know what you're on about, but I'll knock you up a plate of wings at my restaurant, North Ribs Wings. Jezebone and Crawman doth take each other by the arm that they might make haste to the bed, and perhaps less haste thereafter. Suddenly their progress is halted by the appearance of Bartemaisel, who doth glow with a mysterious aura, which might be achieved with grave caution that the mistakes of the premiere might not be repeated by the setting alight of the actor's clothing.
Halt thee, restaurateur.
Oh shit.
Can it be? Doth my newfound proprietor have connections reaching e'en heavenward? I have dug for gold, and gold I have unearthed.
Tell me, O Crawman of the feeding, how is it that thou cometh to thine luxury, when all of Achten Tan doth struggle e'en to find but a single potato, or a peanut that might feed the hungriest babe?
Look, I've already been through all the proper processes. We've had the inspection, we passed all that, we were audited, and that was fine, and all our suppliers are perfectly reputable.
Hold with thine babbling. Your tongue is like a giant rib in which a Tanite builds their home. Sharp, perhaps, but dead.
What can this visitor be implying? Is North Ribs Wings less reputable than it seems?
69 of my kind hath now descended, messages to convey, great warnings, great potents that must be spake, the harbingers of Achten Tan's great fate. Yet these warnings hath been heeded not, nor hath my brethren heavenward returned. And lo, what should I smell one morn, but the scent of spice and angel meat thus burned?
The next line is spoken by Crawman the youth to be delivered unconvincingly if the prowess of the actor doth allow. What? Oh no, surely not.
Alas, we have all eaten of the meat of the ambassadors that come to show us divine grace.
All but I, for I can ever ill afford to dine at such presumptuous tables. Ha! My lack of coin doth now me aid, for I am innocent.
Yeah, no, about that. I've also been putting angel meat in the food packages for underprivileged gnomes.
Fuck!
You, Crawman, must now come with me, and meet thine heavenly judgment for thy sins. No more shalt thou distribute juicy meats that you hath ground from angels' ribs and wings.
Bartemaisel taketh a firm hold of Crawman and doth begin to ascend to heaven, which might be achieved with grave caution that the mistakes of the premiere might not be repeated by the bouncing of the actor upon a large spring. Before the ascension might be completed, Jezebone doth strike Bartemaisel with a big sword.
Jezebone, from whence hath thou withdrawn that big sword?
Thou wanteth not to know.
Ow! Fuck! What the actual shit? Ah!
I am sorry, divine heavenly guest, but I am in love with Crawman, though it be capricious. I will not let thee take him. And the rest is that I also think thou looketh quite delicious.
Jezebel and Croman doth finish the act of killing the angel that he might be dismembered and consumed.
Oh, much obliged, I'll get him on the grill now.
Exit Jezebel and Croman, carrying the deceased body of Bartimazel.
Good heavens, or bad heavens, that's the rub. Who knoweth what punishment may strike for such a deed, done both in malice and in knowledge? I surely hope that this transgression not define a future such that Achten Tan be cursed. And the moral of the story, fair audience, be, though today's old Croman surely is much greater and more reputable than this past fiction hath presented, it remaineth good habit, just in case, to ever check thine ribs for any trace of feathers.
Excellent. We hope you enjoyed this audio presentation. If you did, why not give it 5 stars? We don't know what that means yet, but presumably it will at some point in the future.
I like that play.
Yeah, a few people have told me that it's one of their favourite things in the book, which is awfully flattering, so thank you if you were one of those people.
We must be done now, surely.
Well, hold up, not quite, because if we're doing a Terry episode, we may as well get everything out there, and then I never need to worry about my stuff being featured ever again. This is the Terry-sode, so let's contain me to this one.
All right. So what's the last thing?
Well, now stop me if this sounds familiar, but the story begins with an offhand joke in the group chat.
Of course it does.
There was some sort of chat going on about the various ribs that there would be in the city, because the city's built in a skeleton. So we were talking about the ribs and what they might be called and that sort of thing. And then I think we started talking about how giving directions would work if you were comparing one bit of bone to another. And as it happens, I was reading The City and the City by China Miéville at the time, and I wondered what would happen if the people in Achten Tan all decided to treat the bones as if they came from different animals.
And what would happen, Terry?
Well, post-structural semiotics of reconstructive osteotopography is what would happen, Dee. That's the name of the piece, and like most of the pieces we've talked about, it can be found in Achten Tan, Volume 1 of Tales from the Year Between. And here is an abridged version of that. Many generations ago, when Gerwin the Wise was, well, still old by most reckonings, but far less old than she would eventually become, the incumbent permutation of the Achten Tan Council found itself facing an unusual problem: science. It had long been a truth held self-evident that the village-town-city settlement thing that had become Achten Tan was established within the encircling skeleton of a single enormous beast, sometimes referred to as the boundary, the landwalker, or the bit where it stops being Achten Tan and starts being something else. It just sort of went without saying that everyone was living within the remains of one extremely large, extremely dead creature, and everyone was terribly comfortable with that. It was therefore somewhat perturbing when Graildith, the first person to attempt to make an entire career out of studying the bones, hijacked the any other business section of what had otherwise been a thoroughly enjoyable council session to make an announcement. "There are at least 2 sets of bones," said Graildith, tapping his finger against his fuzzily bearded chin with the air of one who is around 80% certain that they're smarter than 80% of the rest of the people in the room. "There's the creature whose ribs make up north ribs and south ribs, and whose skull is at East Skull Gate, and then there's the ones whose limbs stick up in the middle." "Limbs sticking up in the middle?" demanded Carnimus the librarian. "There are none." "Well, everyone's been calling them vertebrae, but they're segmented limbs." With great aplomb, Graildith unfolded a large map from somewhere. It was the size of a small book when he withdrew it, but expanded into a square of several feet, and he pointed to several of the cartographical diagrams of geographical skeletal features with a telescopic rod. "This comes from some sort of quadruped. This, I suspect, is avian, probably flightless given the scale. This could be either, but I think it more likely to be a third thing rather like a whale, and almost certainly facing in the opposite direction than the other 2. There was a stunned silence. "Well," said Ariela, who tends the god tree eventually, if only because she was becoming increasingly aware that if nobody said anything it would take much longer for her to get back to her knitting. "What do we do about that?" "We spread the word and I become very rich and famous," said Graildith smugly. By the next week, Graildith had made sure that everyone in Achten Tan was well aware of the situation. Hyperbolically aware, even, given that it really ought not to have made much difference. Things were still in the same place after all, but in the minds of many who learned the news, they weren't. By the week after that, there were 4 distinct groups of citizens: the Colossal Canine Citizens Front, the Avian Achtentanians, the Cetacean Civilians Union, and the Undecideds. Then there were those who didn't know which group they wanted to be part of, and the Undecideds were quick to claim those people as their own, but most of them were staunch that no, the fact that they were undecided did not automatically make them capital U Undecideds with the political and ideological baggage that came with that. By the week after that, each of the 4 groups had begun wearing clothing emblazoned with the symbol of their belief, so that a stranger wandering through Achten Tan would be greeted by the sight of crowds of people all wearing tunics with big embroidered dogs, or hats in the shape of birds, or giant round outfits that looked vaguely whalish, or green blazers dotted with question marks. Plus, of course, there was another faction just as big as any of the others, which was resoundingly and decidedly non-committed to anything in particular, and which would have in fact been terribly offended had anyone attempted to tell them that they were a faction. Each of the groups at this point was perfectly content to continue getting along with their lives and allowing everyone else to do the same. It was simply that they were in disagreement about what kind of city they all lived in. They lived in the same city, that wasn't in dispute, it was a matter of emphasis rather than of ontology. This changed the week after Graildith spread the word. One of the colossal canine citizens made the mistake of asking a cetacean civilian for directions to a friend's house on the other side of the city, and was thoroughly dismayed when they found themselves in entirely the wrong place. As it turned out, the cetacean civilian had been using east to mean west and vice versa. With some difficulty, the canine citizen found their way back to the cetacean civilian, who fortunately hadn't moved in the intervening period, and challenged them on this. Using a surprisingly well-drawn diagram, the cetacean civilian patiently explained that while, yes, cardinal directions ought to be reasonably objective, the fact of the matter was that animals were usually drawn walking from left to right, and thus east simply meant on the right-hand side of the map because that's where the big skull is, so we assumed that's the way that the thing was walking. New evidence, however, suggested that the skull of the cetacean would in fact be on the opposite side if it were ever unearthed, and therefore east was the other way. There resulted a public and highly mean-spirited exchange of barbed insults, then of thrown cutlery, and following this the factions resolved to simply believe that none of the others existed. For many months, the city was divided into 4, but ideologically rather than geographically. There were shops for each kind of person, all in a line right next to each other, but 3 of the 4 were insistently invisible to most visitors. The 5th group, of course, just went wherever they liked, however they liked, and thought that the whole thing was just a giant embuggerance up with which they would have preferred not to put. In the end, it was Graildith who resolved the trouble. He'd begun the mess, so it was only fitting that he ended it, and end it he did by announcing once and for all that in fact Achten Tan was officially indeterminate. Undeterminable. The undecideds took this as a victory for them, but Graildith was quick to point out that in fact every group was both correct and incorrect, since it was, he had objectively and finally determined, impossible to objectively and finally determine whether any of the bones came from any particular creature. It could have been that every single bone was a different animal, or that a single mishmashed creature had left one complete and bizarre skeleton, or both, or neither. To help with ongoing inter-osseo-demographical relations, the position of Bone Chief was created. A hallowed office acknowledged by all and respected by most, and to which many aspired, and about which a few hatched nefarious schemes. The Bone Chief's function was to be the final arbiter, resolving any disputes that might arise. If the Bone Chief said something was a radius and not a femur, then that was what it was. Not just what it was called, but what it was, making it yet another position that ought to have mostly worked in the realms of linguistic determination, but was in fact insistently ontological. So Achten Tan, with much grumbling, cohered back into a single unit of confused Achtentanians, exactly as it ought to have been, and as it would ever remain.
Okay, Terry. You've held us in suspense long enough. You promised that you would tell us why you're called Terry, when in the credits you say your name is Chris. So, spill.
Yep, no, you're right. It's time. Well, what happened was, at the start of the game we realised that there were 2 Chris's, since one of them was leader, rightful privilege was his. I did the noble thing and I relinquished my claim to being called Chris, so I needed a new name. Didn't want to be a David, Julie or a Stuart, but Terror of the Deep had a nice ring to it. The problem was it's kinda long and kinda hard to say, but Terry could be short for Terror, that sounds okay. Does that answer your question?
You know, I think it does.
Oh, good.
But just to recap, you and Chris Prime, our fearless leader, are both named Chris. That was very mildly confusing, so you decided to allow him, as leader, to continue to be Chris, meaning you had to pick another name.
Yeah, that's about the long and short of it. I remember trying to work out what I could use as a nickname and just throwing out things like, well, you know, I wouldn't mind if you want to call me She Who Reigns Over Many Continents, or The Raven Whose Wings Encircle the Planet, or Terror from the Deep, or something. I feel bad that I don't remember for sure who it was, but I think it might have been Darby Cupid who said, "What about Terry, short for terror?" And then that just kind of stuck.
Darby is on Twitter as @DarbyCupid, by the way. She writes good books like Crystal and the sequel, Rebel. You should follow her.
I do follow her.
I was talking to the listeners, Terry.
Oh, right.
So, to wrap up.
Yeah, please. I'm ever so sleepy.
Silly Terry. Skullgate Media never sleeps. But okay. To wrap up. 2 blokes who had Chris as a name didn't want to be one and the same. You said, try Terror maybe. And we all said, hi Terry. while helping Chris Prime run the game.
Oh yeah, that's a way better explanation.
Not better, just shorter. And with that, we will let you sleep, Terry. Factum est bonum, we hope you'll join us next time for more sounds from the year between. Have fun and be well. Say goodnight, Terry.
Good night, Terry. And good night, Dee. Alright, credits time. Thank you very much to you. Let's give some credit to you for listening. This episode has taken longer than expected to produce, partly because of the sheer length of it and partly because I got embarrassed that it was about me, but future episodes won't be, so tune in for those. Anyway, Sounds from the Year Between is the podcast production of Skullgate Media, the new independent writers collective publishing cool books and doing cool things. You should follow us on Twitter at Skullgate Media. We're on Instagram and other things as well, and you can also go to skullgatemedia.com or yearbetween.com to find out more about what we're doing. This show is hosted and produced by Chris Durston and Dee Gagliardi. This episode was written mostly by Dee Gagliardi, but all the pieces that you heard were written by me, Chris Durston, and can be found in Achten Tan, Volume 1 of Tales from the Year Between. This episode was edited by Chris Durston, and all the music that you heard in this episode was by Chris Durston. Super big special thank yous to John Mina and Roman Mina for lending their wonderful voices to a couple of the pieces, and also thanks and apologies to Chris Vandyke, who lent his voice to reading out the essay on the hymn. Struggled through reading a lot of things. There's a few clips where he's kind of swearing at me for making things so hard to pronounce, and then I didn't actually include the bits that were hard to pronounce because it was going on really long. So thanks and apologies to Chris Vandyke as well. And that's that from us for now, but take care, stay safe, and we will have more stuff for you soon.